books of the Bible that will help us as Messianic Jewish and Gentile people to learn how to grow together and become more unified as a congregation. So that's really what's happening this morning. I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from some books I have on Romans. And I should just mention to you that Romans, this letter to the Romans, has been studied since it was written by most theologians. The opinions about Romans are very broad. In fact, one writer says that the book of Romans was instrumental in the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Protestant Reformation took place around 1600 of the Common Era, but he says the book of Romans had a big impact on that. And I'm going to say to you that this letter is essential for us to understand as Messianic people. And Paul, in this letter, expressed his heartfelt desire for his own Jewish people to know the Messiah. So let me read a few excerpts from a couple of books I have, and I think you'll see where this goes. This is from a book called Romans for the Practical Messianic. So I guess this author thinks that we Messianics need to be more practical, or something like that. I'll have to ask him about that. He says, the epistle to the Romans widely represents the Apostle Paul's presentation of the good news of salvation to his own Jewish people and those of the nations, set against the backdrop of the circumstances that many in the early body of Messiah were facing. Romans 1, verse 16, undeniably a major theme of not only his letter, but also 20th and 21st century Messianic movement. The verse goes like this: for I am not ashamed of the good news, for it is the power of God unto salvation to all who believe, all who trust, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. What does that mean, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile? Is this God saying Jews are more important than Gentiles? No. But we're going to unpack this as we look at the text itself starting next week. Today's Messianic people have a great appreciation for Romans, but frequently because of classic salvation verses, which are always quite quotable, such as, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. You all know that verse, right? And having now been justified by his blood, and verses like that we can quote, righteousness reigned to eternal life through Yeshua, Messiah, our Lord. These are verses we're familiar with, but are they fully unpacked, fully explained? And we do not think they have been. There's one verse in Romans that says, for Christ is the end of the law. Have you ever heard that verse? I hope you'll be publishing a book on that verse very soon, written by Dr. Jeff Seitz, who you may know, and his wife Barry, because they are focusing on the word telos, which is often means end, but it means something else. So we're going to unpack that verse, because we need to understand the relationship of the Torah to the Messiah, and that's particularly relevant to us Messianics. Romans stands out as extremely significant, the longest sustained piece of writing that originates from Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, and it's listed first in the Pauline body of letters. The first letter is Romans. Now, Romans was not written first, but the compiler of the Bible way, way, way back thought, well, maybe we should make sure that Romans is first. I told you I didn't want it. Yeah. Okay. Oh. I'm sorry. For those of you out there was a technical difficulty. I hit the button, but not with the right object. I hit the button with my finger, not with a cursor, and it just ignored my finger. It's not the kind of screen that you can touch. I forgot. So now we're good. So we'll continue that Romans was considered the most important letter by the early compilers of the Bible, so they put it right after Acts. So you had the Gospels, and you had the Acts of the Apostles, which is sort of a transitionary book between the coming of the Messiah and the spread of the good news. And they always put Romans first. I'm not sure I agree with that, because if the Gospel went, as Romans 1:16 says, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile, maybe the Jewish epistles that we've also studied in the last few years should be first, but we'll see about that. Anyway, it was listed as the most major significant letter in all of Paul's writings. Romans is the most influential letter ever written in history, somebody said. Romans has influenced historical Christianity and its theology, to be sure, but Romans has also in turn influenced the views of those in civil law and politics. Europeans in the Middle Ages and the Protestant Reformation approached the authority of God by reading Romans, the placement of man in God's creation, the role of human authorities, the placement of man in God's creation, the role of God's intended purpose for his chosen people. All of this is in the 16 chapters of the letter to the Romans. So you get to see why this is such an important letter and why I'm excited to share it with you. It's going to be a wonderful time that we're going to learn. If there's one good thing about modern interpreters of the Bible, we know that a text like the Epistle to the Romans, as best as we can, we need it first to be understood as a letter rather than a doctrinal treatise. Paul wrote Romans as a letter to some people. It wasn't his intention to write his theology in Romans. Some of his theology appears in Romans, but it appears elsewhere as well. It was a letter, but we can learn a lot about theology. Theology is the study of God by reading what Paul writes here in Romans. And we're going to find this to be very significant to us as Messianic people. While the Roman believers knew of Paul, they had heard of Paul, and Paul knew some of them, he had never really been to Rome, and he had never had a chance to get to know everybody personally. But his ministry in declaring the good news was beginning to shift from the Eastern European Mediterranean to the Western Mediterranean. Could I have my map now? So as we studied last few weeks, Paul's been in Galatia, remember, and this is Ephesus, where Ephesians was written to, and Colossae, Colossians, Tarsus, where he went for much of his life. And then he's beginning to go this way. He stops off in Corinth, as we're going to hear shortly, and he makes it to Italy, which is where Rome is. He's ultimately, though, desirous of going all the way to Spain. All the way to Spain. Why? Because he was a great man of God, and he knew how important it was to proclaim the good news all over the Mediterranean. But it was a very important letter, is what the point I'm making. So while he didn't know a lot of the people, he wrote them ahead of time to say, I'm coming your way. I'm going to bring some good things, and I'm going to talk to you about your life. And it's that part of this letter that's relevant to us, because we can learn a lot of wonderful things to help us in our walks by understanding the letter to the Romans. Unlike his preceding epistle to the Galatians, which, remember we finished this, we spent about 2 or 3 months on Galatians. Who remembers that we studied Galatians here? So some of you were not actually present. Even though you might have been here physically, you weren't present. We studied Galatians for months, and we learned a lot about the relationship between Gentiles and the Torah, remember? There was an issue happening in Galatia where there were some people saying, hey, now that you're saved, you got to start keeping the Torah to be super saved. Remember that? Hello, remember that? Okay. Well, the letter to the Galatians was written to explain to people, as I shared with you, that you did not have to keep the Torah to be saved, but to learn the ways of God, the walk of God, the halacha of God. You needed to study the Torah, not to be saved, but to be what? Sanctified. And meaning growing in the Messiah, okay? So I made that clear. Romans comes next. It's the next letter that he wrote, we think. And it's very important to understand this because it's not a systematic theology that he's writing. He's writing a letter to some friends who needed to be helped. The message of Romans is timeless, but it was to be understood as a specific letter to a specific issue in Romans. Now, in the letter to the Romans, you're going to learn about. Are you ready? Are you sitting down? Yeah, you are sitting down. That's good. You're going to learn about justification, salvation, reconciliation, atonement, freedom, sanctification, transformation, new life in the Messiah, glorification, and the good news of the Messiah, and also human sin. All packed into the letter to the Romans. So can you imagine how excited I am, because all these doctrines, you can go to seminary and have a class on every one of the doctrines I just read about. That's what you do in seminary. Just take a doctrine like sanctification, you can have a whole class on it, a whole course, semester. It's called systematic theology. But this letter was not written as systematic theology, but a lot of the things that are theological that we need to learn about are found in this letter. So we're going to enjoy that. Romans was certainly employed, as I said, by Christian figures down to the ages like Augustine, Luther, Calvin, and Wesley, and generally by every generation throughout Christian history, especially in the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation, for those of you who don't know, was what changed the direction of the entire church from Catholicism to Protestantism. Has anybody heard that before? Some of you may be Catholics in your background, and now you are, let's call yourselves Protestants or believers. The Catholic Church was the initial body of believers starting in Rome, and they got things wrong. So by the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was way off from the gospel and way off from the Bible. And the reformers, such as Martin Luther, who you've heard about, and John Calvin, who you heard about, they reformed the Catholic Church, and they were protesting, and it became called Protestantism. That's a little church history for you, okay? It's free. Where necessary, we will engage with some of the Romans passages where there are key historical precedents and important streams of thought which need to be recognized. At the same time, while some of these will be beneficial to consider, some of these will also prove to be undeveloped or lacking additional information. Now, there's a new Reformation happening. You know this? A new Reformation called Messianic Judaism. Now, the Reformation that happened in the mid-second millennium, it's called the Protestant Reformation, changed history enormously. And I think what I'm trying to tell you is that Messianic Judaism is changing history again. Because people are reading the Bible now through Jewish eyes for the first time. And they're beginning to understand things they never understood before. So we are part of this Reformation. I'd say we're at the beginning of it. But we don't even know what the end will be, except I do know that all Israel will be saved as a result of our part of this new Messianic Reformation, I'll call it that. A significant number of Jewish people are coming to faith in Israel's Messiah, and non-Jewish believers, like many here, are embracing their Hebrew roots in a very tangible way, but also via theological trends which are taking better care to approach and interpret the Apostle Paul as a first-century Jew. That's really something new. You hear it from me all the time. But if you go to most churches and you talk about Paul, they're not going to look at him as a first-century Jew. They might look at him as St. Paul, the good first Catholic. Or maybe St. Peter, another good Catholic. You get my sarcasm, my irony here? It's amazing to me that for the last 2,000 years, and I say this humbly, the church has been off base. It lost its Jewish roots. Romans restores them. A quote from a scholar, James D.G. Dunn, says, "From his Pharisaic training, no doubt came Paul's tremendous grasp of the Scriptures, not only the Torah, but also the prophets and the writings, which is put to such extensive use in this letter. He also shows knowledge of Jewish writings, which circulated in the diaspora without attaining the status of scripture. There was a lot of Jewish literature around in those days, but the ones who determined what should be called Bible did not put those letters in scripture, but they were around and they were important to inform the readers what they were reading. So things like the Talmud or the traditions of the fathers and other writings were prevalent in those days, but they weren't called scriptures, so you don't find them in your Bible. Some of them are in the Catholic Bible in a section in the middle called the Apocrypha. Anyway, it's good stuff. That's what we learn about Hanukkah, by the way. Hanukkah is described in the intercanonical books of the Apocrypha. So there's a lot of good stuff that we miss it's great for us to learn. So from his Pharisaic training, no doubt came his skill as a Bible student with not a few insights that nobody else has seen before. The basic point for our understanding of the letter to the Romans, however, is that it's a Jewish letter, coming from a man of a Pharisaic background, and it became and remained an integral part of Paul. His self-identity as a Jew and his concern with his heritage of his people provide one side of the dialogue which continues throughout the whole letter and runs back and forward throughout the entire pattern. Considering Paul's Jewish background and the intertextual references he makes to the Tanakh, to extra-biblical references like the Mishnah and Midrash, the commentary, Messianic Jewish commentary, he also makes considering his personal pain over the wide-scale Jewish rejection of Yeshua. We read his heart breaking for his people, and I so want you all to have broken hearts too for my people Israel. I know many of you do. I know many of you pray for the peace of Jerusalem. I hope through the letter that we study here, the letter to the Romans, we will all find ourselves, our hearts broken for our people Israel, and remember to pray for the salvation of Israel. That is the first mission statement of our congregation, to help reach out to the Jewish people. So, those are some introductory comments I wanted to make, but now a couple more. When we look at a new book in the Bible, a question always is asked, who wrote it? It's not that we don't know who says he wrote it. We want to know who wrote a book of the Bible. So the letters of the Newer Covenant, particularly, many of them say, I, Paul, am writing this or whatever. We need to verify if he did indeed do that, because back in those days, different people kind of quoted there were no laws of plagiarism. So people would take other stuff and put their name on it, and who knew what would happen. But there's no doubt that Paul, Rabbi Saul, wrote the letter to the Romans. That's not disputed by anybody. It's widely recognized by all contemporary expositors of Romans that the purpose for Paul writing this letter was to prepare the Roman believers for his personal visit that was going to take place soon. Paul's work in the East, which I just showed you, where we talked about the Galatians, had largely been accomplished. He finished in Galatia. He straightened out all those congregations in Galatia, at least for a time. And now he wants to expand the good news westward. He's a strategist. He's finished with the East, now he's going to go to the West. For a time, he was in Antioch and Ephesus. They were like headquarters for him and his team. And now he's planning to go to Rome as the hub for evangelization of the rest of the world. Paul was planning to use Rome as the hub, the base of operations for his outreach to the rest of the world. Now, we know that according to several verses in Romans, like chapter 1, verses 10 through 15, and chapter 15, that he indicated a desire to go to Spain. I mean, Spain, if you think of the map of the Mediterranean, but you can't see it, it's way out there, is at the very western end of Europe, western end of the Mediterranean Sea. So he, in his mind, he thought, I'm going to cover the whole Mediterranean area, right? I mean, that's a man with a vision. I mean, some people think I may cover Clarksville, or maybe Maryland. Paul knew his calling was to the entire Mediterranean area, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. He gave his life to this purpose. So he wanted to go and expand west. We know from the book of Acts that Paul would make it to the city of Rome, but we don't think he ever made it to Spain. So where was Paul when he wrote this letter? Most people think that he was in Corinth. You see Corinth up on the map, up there, right? Next to Italy. So he was on his way west, and he wrote the people in Rome a letter, a physical letter, not an email. They didn't have email then. Sorry, young lady and young lady. No email back then. They had to write a letter. So he wrote a letter, and he found somebody to deliver the letter, a woman named Phoebe. She was the post lady. So he writes this letter, and he said, hey, Phoebe, take this. Well, he didn't say Phoebe, did he? He said, Phoebe, take this letter to Rome, to the believers in Rome. He had heard about them, but he had something to tell them in this letter. Basically, I'm coming your way. I got some things to say, and here's what we're going to be talking about. He loved the people in Rome. Now, both conservatives and liberal theologians alike are convinced that the vicinity around Corinth in that middle section there is where he wrote the letter to the Romans. So he wrote it approximately 56 to 58 of the Common Era. It's important to know this because it puts it in perspective. There were some things happening historically in this period of time, namely some problems with Rome, with the Roman government. So it helps us to know the context that's going on when these things are being written. This is considered Paul's third missionary journey. He would go out from Jerusalem, come back, go out, come back, and go out. This is his third missionary journey. And it was intended to help the poor Jewish believers in Rome, and also to help straighten out some of the doctrinal errors that were taking place in this day. One of the reasons it's important to know that it was written around 56, 57, 58 of the Common Era. I say Common Era rather than AD, because Jews talk about that, the post-birth of Yeshua time, as Common Era rather than AD. AD stands for the year of our Lord, and Jewish people don't want to say the year of our Lord because they have not yet accepted that Yeshua is Lord. So we say the Common Era. Same thing as AD, don't get confused. But the reason that it was important was that there were these Roman edicts that are known historically that were put forth in these days against Jews. The Romans went back and forth. They loved the Jews being there because it was good for Rome sometimes, and then the Jews got too popular or too wealthy or something, and Rome said, no, we can't have that, and they would restrict that. So a lot of what's happening in the letter to the Romans took place during this period of sometimes positive relationships with Rome. By Rome, I mean the Roman government, because Rome controlled all the real estate in the Mediterranean was controlled by the Roman government, even all the way down to Israel. You know, Rome was very powerful, very powerful. So the epistle to the Romans specifically addresses in verse 7 of the first chapter to all those who are beloved of God in Rome. That means the believers. Rome was the capital of the Roman Empire and was a highly diverse city of people. They figured about 500,000 people lived in Rome, and about 50,000 of them were Jews. So that's a large percentage of the Roman government were Jewish. And they were great citizens, as Jews have been everywhere we've been expelled to. But sometimes we were not popular. Traditional Christian history sees that the city of Rome was influenced by Paul and Peter in earlier days, And they are the ones who founded this community of believers in Rome. Some people would say this Roman church. I don't use the term church because it's so confusing to me and the Jewish people. But Peter and Paul probably started this group of people getting together. And now Paul's coming back to help straighten out some things. Now this is something that you're going to find interesting. Do you remember when I talked about Shaul or Pentecost, and we read about the believers gathering in the upper room and a miracle happened, and they all were able to speak in languages that they had heretofore not known? You remember me talking about that? And I said, Jews from all over the known world were coming to Jerusalem to celebrate Pentecost, or to celebrate Shavuot. It's really called Shavuot. The Greek version of that is Pentecost. Every year when we come to that holiday, I explain that, but I'm not going to do it again now. So what was that? What happened? Well, there are Jews that came down from Rome to Jerusalem for Shavuot. It's one of the 3 times a year that the Jewish people were commanded to go to Jerusalem for Passover, Pentecost, and Sukkot, tabernacles. Parenthetically, for those of you who are interested in going on a trip to Israel with us, which we're thinking about for next year, we are looking into going during Shavuot or Tabernacles. It's a great time to be there. Or maybe go during Pentecost. So stay tuned, we'll find out more. We're talking to different tour companies now. So what happened? These believers go to Jerusalem, this miracle happens, all of a sudden they're able to speak languages or dialects they never knew before. These are the people. Then they came back to Rome, all fire on fire. They'd seen the miracle workings of God. They'd heard Peter preach about the gospel, and they got saved, and they were just psyched up and on fire because they had seen the hand of God working. These are the people that came back to Rome and are there now that Paul is writing to. Okay, I'm trying to put all this together for you because I'm connecting Acts, Corinthians, and Romans for you at the moment. So the Romans would not have made a distinction between the Jews and the Jewish believers in Yeshua. They were all the same to them. Like if Adolf Hitler showed up in Maryland next week, God forbid, and he was rounding up Jews, he would say, oh, you're a Reformed Jew? You're okay. You're a Messianic Jew? Nah. You're an Orthodox Jew? Yeah, we need you. All the Jews would go. There was no distinction. And in Rome, they made no distinction between the Orthodox Jews, the Messianic Jews, and any Jewish people. They were all Jews. They didn't know at this point. They didn't care. The Romans didn't care. So they would have expelled all the Jewish people from Rome, whether they were Messianic Jews or not. And this, in a way, I think is a prediction of what the future is going to be for us. There might well come a time, prophetically speaking, I'm not a prophet, but what I've read in the Bible, in the prophecy world, is that there will be an anti-Semitism against Jews throughout the entire world in the last days. How many of you have ever heard that? Yeah. It's in Zechariah and other places that the whole world is going to turn against Israel, that is the Jewish people, in the last days. Well, I think what's going to happen is that we Messianic people, Jewish and Gentiles, because you're part of this whole thing too, we're going to be ending up in the same place as the rest of the Jewish community. And they're going to say, what's going on? And guess what? We get to teach our own people what's going on. We need to be ready to share this, but we will be. So that's what I see happening. That's what was happening there in Rome. A couple more points. I'm just trying to share some miscellaneous things by way of introduction of the book. We're not going to get into it today. We need to remember, as we study Romans, that it is a letter that has theology in it, but it's not a theological treatise. It was not meant to be that. Somebody once said that Galatians, how many of you remember that we studied Galatians a few months ago? Let's see a show of hands. I hope more people raise their hands now. The letter that we've been studying for a few months is Galatians. You see it up there? And what we learned from Galatians, the main thing was that Gentiles can choose to follow Torah, but they don't have to follow Torah for salvation. It's a good idea to learn the ways of God, yes, but it's not a requirement for salvation. That was the problem in Galatia. Paul straightened that out, and now he's going to Rome to straighten out another issue. But somebody said, it has been said that if Galatians is the Magna Carta of the gospel, Romans is the Constitution. The theological substance of this letter had to be presented to the believers in the first century, whether addressed to Rome or not. But there were circumstances in Rome that made it more appropriate that Paul, in a very calm frame of mind, wrote this theology for fuller elaboration. Scholars sense the writing of Paul in Galatians, and they compare it to the writing in Romans, and they say it seems like Paul was calm when he was writing Romans, but anxious when he was writing Galatians. You remember this. What did he call the Galatians in chapter 3, verse 1? Do you remember I told you?
Stupid.
He really chewed them out. What did he say to them?
Stupid.
You what, Galatians?
Stupid.
You stupid Galatians. Paul was a little uptight when he wrote to the Galatians, but he was writing to the Romans. It says he was calm because he was sitting probably on a beach looking over the Mediterranean Sea. He was calm. Maybe he had his computer out, writing good stuff. He was calmed down, which was not his nature. But so that's why he was able to write Romans as such a wonderful letter. So we need to remember that it was a letter. Now, just by way of introduction, the first 8 chapters of Romans, which I'm going to go through fairly quickly, is theology. It's very heavy and heavy stuff. There are certain parts of it I do want to share with you to expand, but I'm very eager to get to Romans 9, 10, and 11, chapters 9, 10, 11, because that is where Paul explains the relationship between Jews and Gentiles in the body of Messiah. And that is the reason, that's the main reason I chose Romans to teach this next round, because we need to get this straightened out for our people, and it also helps us understand how to reach our own people, the Jewish people. And that's what it focuses on more at that point. Let's see, one more thing. The Epistle to the Romans has a wide amount of significance for today's Messianic movement, the same as it has had for religious movements in previous history. There are some distinct sections of Romans that are quite important for today's broad community of Messianic believers. The salvation history message of Romans chapters 9 through 11 I just mentioned, and Paul's word that the nations are grafted into Israel. And we're going to talk about what that means to be grafted in. We're going to use some material from horticulture. Growing plants, horticulture, growing trees. We're going to use some material from that, and it'll help us understand our relationship as being grafted in together. But so the salvation history message of Romans 9 through 11, and Paul's word that the nations are grafted into Israel, they're of great importance for mixed messianic assemblies of Jewish and non-Jewish believers. That's us. There are, though, areas of difficulty in Romans for today's Messianic community. For example, Romans 7, chapter 7 is challenging for us to read, so I'm going to focus a little bit on that one, particularly the expression of what it means to be made dead to the Torah. You've read that. What does it mean to die to the Torah? What do these things mean? I'm going to re-explain those or re-present those to you. The nuances presenting Israel in chapters 9 through 11. There are many people who think that it's speaking about the church there. So we've got to get those things squared away. Romans 14 speaks of strong and weak and eating certain foods and not eating certain foods on special days. We've all read this before. I hope I can unpack it for us and explain it well. Each one of these sections of Romans does require some more careful reading on the part of Messianic believers, with attention given to the underlying text and understanding the ancient settings and context of Paul's instruction to his original people. The applications of Romans were still developing, and maturing Messianic movement, now in the 2019, we're in 2019, yeah, challenges, the applications for still developing and maturing Messianic movement will be quite significant as we consider our future together. You know I'm excited, right? I hope you get excited too. Please start reading Romans. We're going to pick up Romans 1 next week.